because I lost everything after 2020. And it's hard for me because I'm still trying to take care of my children as a blue-collar man.
The transformation from wealth to financial devastation arrived with stunning speed. In a 2024 Fox News interview that sent shockwaves through the combat sports world, UFC Hall of Famer Tito Ortiz stood in the parking lot of his Florida restaurant and made a confession that few former champions would dare admit publicly. The man who once commanded six-figure paychecks, who saved the UFC from bankruptcy with his drawing power, who lived in multi-million-dollar California mansions, looked directly into the camera and said the words that crystallized decades of financial mismanagement in combat sports. "I lost everything after 2020. The statement landed like a knockout punch to anyone who remembered Ortiz during his championship reign. From 2000 to 2003, the Huntington Beach bad boy stood as the most recognizable fighter in mixed martial arts, a bleach-blonde, trash-talking champion who headlined the events that literally saved the UFC from going under. UFC 40 in November 2002 with Ortiz facing Ken Shamrock at the MGM Grand Arena in Las Vegas drew 150,000 pay-per-view buys, more than triple what previous Zuffa events had generated. At the time, the UFC was hemorrhaging money, averaging a mere 45,000 buys per event and facing potential bankruptcy. Many credit that single fight and Ortiz's star power with keeping the promotion alive long enough to eventually become a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Ortiz's financial journey represents one of the most dramatic falls in UFC history. Born to heroin-addicted parents in Huntington Beach, California, he spent his childhood sleeping in cars and motels, stealing to survive, sniffing glue, and cycling through juvenile detention centers. Wrestling gave him structure and eventually a path to the UFC. By his mid-20s, he had escaped that nightmare and achieved what seemed impossible: championship-level wealth in a sport that barely paid its fighters. He purchased multiple properties: a 3,889-square-foot house in Huntington Beach for $3.4 million in 2008, a house in Big Bear Lake bought from boxer Oscar De La Hoya for $2.1 million in 2007, and a house in Scottsdale, Arizona, purchased for $612,000 in early 2006 with his first wife, Kristen. The lavish lifestyle accelerated when Ortiz began dating adult film star Jenna Jameson in the summer of 2006. Ortiz was 31, freshly divorced, and at the peak of his earning power. The relationship thrust him into an entirely different stratosphere of celebrity, turning the couple into Southern California paparazzi fixtures. They lived together in the Huntington Beach waterfront property from 2008 until their highly publicized split in 2013, a relationship that would later spawn bitter legal disputes. In a 2015 lawsuit, Jameson claimed she contributed to most of the down payment on the home and should have owned half the property. The suit alleged that during their 5 years together, Jameson maintained the house, acted as his intimate companion, and cared for their twin sons, with the understanding that she would share equally in the property. Ortiz, who had sole custody of the twins, remained the only name on the title of the home, which was valued at approximately $2.09 million at the time of the lawsuit. But the real financial bloodletting came from a pattern that has destroyed countless athletes across every sport, spending money as if championship paychecks would flow forever, with zero contingency planning for when the winnings stopped. During his fighting prime, Ortiz lived the lifestyle of someone who believed his earning power was permanent. Fast cars, lavish parties, expensive real estate holdings across multiple states, and the costs associated with dating someone as famous as Jameson all drained resources at a pace that would have required consistent title defenses and main event paydays to sustain. The problem was that Ortiz's performance in the octagon had begun declining precipitously by the mid-2000s. After losing his light heavyweight title to Randy Couture at UFC 44 in September 2003, Ortiz entered a devastating losing streak. He dropped his next fight to Chuck Liddell at UFC 47, then won only one fight out of his next 7 bouts. His contract disputes with the UFC became legendary. After a series of mediocre performances, Ortiz demanded more money and walked away from the organization entirely. The UFC erased him from promotional materials, and most observers assumed they'd never see him fight for the promotion again. He eventually returned, but the days of championship money were gone. From UFC 47 in April 2004 through the end of his UFC career in 2012, Ortiz compiled a record of 5-8-1, never again challenging for a title. The money stopped flowing, but the expenses didn't stop. This is where the UFC compensation structure reveals its cruelty. Unlike athletes in the NBA, NFL, or MLB, where approximately half of league revenues are distributed to players through collective bargaining, agreements, and guaranteed contracts, UFC fighters receive between 16 and 20% of total revenue. The UFC's own internal study showed figures at roughly 18.6%, 4 times less than even Major League Soccer. When a fighter falls from championship status to mid-card or prelim fighter status, the financial cliff is catastrophic. There are no guaranteed contracts, no pension plans, no health insurance beyond what covers injuries sustained during fights. Every training camp, every coach, every nutritionist, every medical bill comes directly out of the fighter's pocket. Ortiz's situation deteriorated further through his transition to Bellator in 2014, where he went 3-1 but earned far less than his UFC peak. His 2018 boxing match against Chuck Liddell under Golden Boy Promotions ended with Ortiz getting knocked out in the first round. His 2021 professional boxing debut against Anderson Silva ended even more quickly and brutally. Silva knocked him out in the first round. Humiliating finish that effectively ended Ortiz's combat sports career. These late career fights were transparently motivated by financial need, desperate attempts to recapture something, anything, from his glory days. The COVID-19 pandemic delivered the final blow. Public records revealed that Ortiz collected unemployment checks during the height of the pandemic, admitting that he burned through his savings between December 2019 and January 2021 with no source of income. The revelation sparked controversy and accusations of government fraud, given that Ortiz was simultaneously serving as the pro tempore mayor of Huntington Beach, technically an employed position. Chael Sonnen, Ortiz's former Bellator opponent, couldn't resist twisting the knife. Update: thieves break into Tito Ortiz's house, find nothing of value, then leave $20 and a few scratch-offs. The mockery stung because it was true. After decades of million-dollar fights, after headlining the events that saved the UFC, after living in multiple mansions and driving exotic cars, Ortiz had nothing left. In his Fox News interview, speaking from his Florida restaurant Tito's Cantina Tequila Bar and Grill in Cape Coral, a business he opened after fleeing California, Ortiz described himself as a blue-collar man trying to redo the American dream. The restaurant represents his attempt to build something sustainable, something that doesn't require getting punched in the face or risking permanent brain damage. It's really hard for me, because being a blue-collared man with 3 boys and a future of them, I gotta make sure I stand up and let my voice be heard, Ortiz told Fox and Friends. The man who once commanded the spotlight through athletic dominance now seeks attention through political activism, railing against border policies and government overreach, positioning himself as a working-class everyman who lost everything to circumstances beyond his control. Whether those circumstances truly were beyond his control, or whether they were the predictable result of financial illiteracy and unchecked spending, depends on who you ask. Ortiz's fall mirrors countless stories throughout combat sports history, but it's particularly striking given his role in UFC history. This wasn't some journeyman fighter who had a few decent years. This was the man who literally saved the promotion. UFC 40's success, built on Ortiz's star power, provided the foundation for everything that came after. The Ultimate Fighter reality show, the Fox television deal, the eventual $4 billion sale to WME-IMG. None of that happens without UFC 40 proving that mixed martial arts could draw mainstream audiences. Ortiz deserved generational wealth for his contribution. Instead, he's operating a restaurant in Florida and calling himself a blue-collar worker. The pattern repeats itself with devastating consistency across UFC history. Tyron Woodley's confession to Ariel Helwani about blowing through enormous amounts of money shocked fans, but it shouldn't have. Woodley had consolidated his position at the top of the welterweight division for years, defeating elite competition and building what appeared to be a sustainable career. Championship money flowed in, and with it came the lifestyle adjustments: bigger house, better cars, more expensive everything. When he lost the title to Kamaru Usman at UFC 235 in March 2019, the money stopped almost immediately. The big money fights disappeared. The main event slots went to other fighters. The harsh reality of UFC compensation hit home. "I blew through a lot of fucking money, man. A lot," Woodley admitted in an interview that exposed the financial illiteracy plaguing combat sports. "When you come from where I come from, you never imagine making that type of money. You work hard for it, and I didn't get there by accident, but nobody taught me finance. Everybody taught me 1 + 1 is 2. That's math. That ain't finance. That ain't wealth. That ain't investing. That ain't saving. That's basically, you made money and fucking you spend it." Woodley's honesty revealed the core problem. These fighters, many coming from impoverished backgrounds, receive zero financial education. They're thrown into situations where they're suddenly making hundreds of thousands of dollars per fight. Life-changing money for someone who grew up poor. But nobody teaches them about taxes, about investing, about sustainable wealth building. The UFC provides no financial literacy programs, no mandatory consultation with financial advisors, no guardrails whatsoever. Fighters are independent contractors, responsible for everything themselves, often signing contracts they don't fully understand. The expenses pile up faster than most people realize. A typical training camp for a UFC main event fighter costs between $50,000 and $100,000. That includes coaches' salaries, training partners, nutritionists, physical therapists, massage therapists, travel costs, and facility fees. Then comes the IRS bill. Fighters pay self-employment taxes on top of regular income taxes, often reaching 40 to 45% of their gross pay. Then managers and agents take their cut, typically 10 to 20%. Medical bills for injuries sustained in training or competition can reach tens of thousands of dollars. Many fighters spend $10,000 to $30,000 per year just on medical insurance that actually covers combat sports injuries. Do the math on a fighter who makes $150,000 for a fight. After taxes, $60,000, $70,000, training camp costs, $75,000, manager fees, $15,000 or $30,000, and medical expenses, $10,000, that fighter walks away with almost nothing, maybe $5,000 to $10,000 for 6 months of work. If they win and get a performance bonus, the numbers improve. But one serious injury, one loss that drops them down the rankings, one contract negotiation that goes poorly, and they're suddenly in a financial hole. There's no safety net, no players' union negotiating, minimum salaries, no pension system building long-term security. UFC Hall of Famer Mark Coleman's story illustrates how quickly champion-level fighters can fall into desperate circumstances. Coleman became the first UFC heavyweight champion in 1997, pioneering the ground-and-pound style that would define mixed martial arts for decades. He dominated early UFC tournaments, winning at UFC 10 and UFC 11 before capturing the heavyweight title at UFC 12. His success continued in Pride Fighting Championships, where he won the 2000 Pride Grand Prix tournament. For years, Coleman represented the pinnacle of heavyweight fighting, a legendary figure who should have been financially secure for life. Instead, by 2015, Coleman was broke, injured, and desperate. A hip replacement surgery in 2013 had led to complications. His hip popped out of socket multiple times, and he developed a serious infection that brought him close to death. Without health insurance or savings, Coleman faced mounting medical bills he had no way to pay. His longtime training partner, Wes Sims, set up a GoFundMe account without Coleman's knowledge, revealing to MMA Fighting that Coleman had not saved up a significant amount of money and had lost a lot of funds to bad investments. The GoFundMe page painted a devastating picture. Mark had a hip replacement in 2013, and after surgery was named wrestling coach for Team Penn on season 19, The Ultimate Fighter. After filming and returning home, his hip popped out several times, and pain began on the other side. He has struggled and lived with the pain for well over a year, and became sick a couple weeks ago. He was taken to hospital where a doctor checked him out and had to stay for 4 days on antibiotics. When released, he went to see hip doctor again and scheduled to have surgery on March 9th, only to discover while open on operating table, he was full of infection and very close to being septic and lucky to have caught this. Coleman remained, hospitalized with a plastic hip until a full surgery could be performed in April. The campaign expressed that Coleman had no income and his insurance was about to run out. Donations poured in from fans and fellow fighters, ultimately raising $45,000, a fraction of what his medical bills would total. Coleman's Pride Grand Prix Tournament Trophy, one of the most prestigious awards in mixed martial arts history, had already been sold on eBay the previous year. He had sold his UFC championship belts, his fight memorabilia, everything of value. In a later ESPN interview, Coleman admitted he had been living in an extended-stay hotel in Columbus, Ohio, alone, surrounded by beer cans, his bathroom fixtures clogged and unusable. Coleman's vulnerability in admitting his financial mistakes stands out. "I don't like to be in this position, but I put myself in this position, and that's a fact," he told the MMA Hour in 2015. "I made some good money, but made some mistakes and put myself in this position." The bad investments referenced by Wes Sims were never fully detailed, but they represent a common pattern among combat sports athletes. Trusting the wrong people, investing in businesses they don't understand, buying depreciating assets instead of building wealth. Coleman's story took an even darker turn in March 2024 when he was hospitalized after heroically saving his parents from a house fire in Fremont, Ohio, suffering smoke inhalation and near-fatal injuries in the process. The 59-year-old former champion, who had spent years rebuilding his life after his financial collapse, nearly died saving his elderly parents. His dogs Hammer and King Martello had represented a fresh start, symbols of his recovery from the darkest period of his life when he had lived in that Columbus extended-stay hotel, drunk and isolated. The fire threatened to erase all that progress. BJ Penn's descent from UFC legend to legal pariah represents perhaps the most tragic financial and personal collapse in UFC history. Penn, known as the Prodigy, became the first American to win the World Jiu-Jitsu Championship in 2000. He went on to become just the second fighter in UFC history to win titles in two different weight classes, welterweight and lightweight, cementing his legacy as one of the greatest fighters of all time. His 2008 induction into the UFC Hall of Fame seemed to guarantee his place in combat sports immortality. But Penn's post-fighting life has been a catastrophe. Legal troubles began in January 2015 when he was arrested in Kihei, Hawaii, for assault after allegedly punching friend Kua Uipo Mokiao and fracturing his eye socket during a brawl outside a bar. That incident set off a chain of arrests and legal problems that have continued for nearly a decade. In 2019, his former partner Shilin Uiwa filed a restraining order alleging years of physical and sexual abuse, threatening her and her family. A judge granted a temporary restraining order extended through 2021. That same year, Penn was involved in multiple bar fights, including an incident in Honolulu and another on Hawaii's Big Island. The violence continued. Penn was arrested for suspected DUI in Hanaka, Hawaii, in 2021. In May 2025, at age 46, Penn was arrested 3 times in 6 days in Hilo, Hawaii, for abuse of a family or household member, specifically his elderly mother, Lorraine Shin. On May 26, he was charged with offensive physical contact after allegedly stealing Shin's mail, shining a flashlight in her eyes, and shoving her against a vehicle. Released on $2,000 bail, he was arrested again the next day for violating a 48-hour stay-away order by returning to Shin's home. His mother's restraining order, effective until March 2030, now includes protections for Penn's ex-partner and children. Most disturbing was Penn's social media behavior during this period. He posted bizarre claims that family members had been killed and replaced by imposters, suggesting severe mental health issues or possible chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, from decades of absorbing head trauma. Fellow fighters have expressed deep concern, with many attributing his behavior to brain damage from fighting. Penn's last 7 UFC fights were all losses, ending with a decision defeat to Clay Guida at UFC 237 in May 2019. Dana White released him from his contract in September 2019, saying, "He won't fight again. That's it. It's a wrap." What I saw in that video was sad. Financially, Penn's situation remains unclear, but his ownership of the BJPenn.com MMA news site and his investment in UFC gyms in Hawaii suggest he maintained some business sense even as his personal life collapsed. His failed 2022 gubernatorial run in Hawaii, where he was eliminated in the Republican primary, indicated continued financial resources for political ambitions. But the mounting legal fees from multiple arrests, the restraining orders, the potential civil suits from his alleged victims, all of this suggests financial resources under severe strain. Diego Sanchez's fall represents another variation on the theme. Once considered a formidable fighter with a promising career, Sanchez told Bleacher Report about his dramatic fall. "Go big or go home. I used to say that. I was addicted to that. The lifestyle, the fame, the girls, the parties. And with that came a lot of people who didn't really care about me. Mixing with the wrong crowd cost him more than just money. It cost him relationships, his health, and nearly his career." Sanchez's late career association with controversial coach Joshua Fabia became a public spectacle, with many in the MMA community expressing concern that Sanchez was being exploited and manipulated. His messy departure from the UFC in 2021, combined with years of erratic behavior and questionable decision-making, painted a picture of someone who had lost his way completely. Even active contenders face shocking financial struggles. Jared Cannonier, ranked as the number 3 middleweight in 2021, publicly discussed his financial strife in conversations with Daniel Cormier and Ariel Helwani. Cannonier detailed his intentions to take another fight instead of waiting for a title shot against Israel Adesanya, citing financial desperation as the driving factor. "I had no source of generating revenue like sponsors or deals in the entertainment business. However, I was spending a significant amount of money on gyms, taxes, credit cards, my kids, and more," Cannonier explained. His estimated net worth at the time was just $1 million. Shocking for a top 3 ranked fighter in the premier MMA organization. The fact that an elite contender who could challenge for a world championship faces financial pressure to fight, rather than wait for optimal timing, exposes how broken the UFC compensation system truly is. Mike Perry's Instagram post from 2019 laid bare the financial reality even more explicitly. 58 to show, Uruguay took 17, management and team 15%. Still got last year's taxes. Nose job priceless. Money in the bank $6,000. 400K fans on IG though. Perry's brutal honesty showed how quickly UFC money disappears. He earned $58,000 to show, meaning he'd have made another $58,000 if he won, but Uruguay took $17,000 in taxes for hosting the event. His management and team took 15%. He still owed taxes from the previous year, and after medical expenses, the nose job, he had literally $6 in his bank account despite having 400,000 Instagram followers. The pattern repeats endlessly. Felice Herrig, who retired from the strawweight division, detailed both physical and financial hardships in court documents filed as part of the UFC antitrust lawsuit. "Fighting for the UFC was the achievement of what I thought was my dream. But the reality is after a lengthy career, I left with a worn-down body, severe depression, and nothing to show for my years competing at the top of the sport," Herrig wrote. "I still battle depression to this day and am angry that I saw so little reward for what I provided to the UFC." Herrig detailed devastating injuries sustained during her career: torn ACL, MCL, PCL, and meniscus in her right knee, requiring multiple surgeries. "After almost a year, and with my insurance coverage running out for the initial occurrence, my knee was not fully healed, but I took a fight anyway, and discovered I needed additional surgery on my meniscus. This knee continues to give me problems to this day, and will require ongoing maintenance and physical therapy for the rest of my life." The financial pressure to fight before she was healed, driven by lack of income and expiring insurance coverage, created permanent damage that will affect her for decades. Jessica Ai, who challenged for the UFC title, discussed similar struggles after retiring in 2022. The physical toll fighting took on her brain and body made transitioning to a new career nearly impossible. "While fighting for the UFC, I suffered many significant injuries, including to my left elbow, which required Tommy John surgery, removal of my gallbladder," Ai detailed in court documents. The medical expenses, combined with the lack of marketable skills outside fighting, left her in financial limbo. The contrast with other professional sports becomes more glaring with each story. NBA players have a pension fund and minimum salaries guaranteed by the players' union. NFL players have health care for life for injuries sustained during their careers. MLB players have the strongest union in professional sports, ensuring even minimum salary players earn over $700,000 annually. UFC fighters have none of these protections. They're classified as independent contractors, meaning the organization has no obligation to provide health care, pensions, or even a minimum wage. A fighter could compete on a UFC card, suffer a career-ending injury, and be dropped from the roster with zero compensation. The UFC antitrust lawsuit, which resulted in a $375 million settlement, exposed the organization's anti-competitive practices to suppress fighter wages. Former UFC fighters accused Zuffa LLC, the UFC's parent company, of creating a monopsony, a market where one buyer, the UFC, holds disproportionate power over suppliers, the fighters. The settlement, while significant, represented a fraction of what fighters claimed they were owed. Matt Brown's comments about the UFC's $7.7 billion deal with Paramount and CBS captured the fighters' frustration. Of course, we're early on in the deal. We just heard about it today. If history tells us anything, this is not going to change anything for fighters. Maybe it will. We're going to have to see how that plays out. History did indeed tell fighters everything they needed to know. When the UFC was sold in 2016 for $4 billion to WME-IMG, fighter compensation didn't meaningfully increase despite the organization's valuation skyrocketing. The UFC allocates roughly 16 to 20% of revenue to fighter pay, compared to the NBA, 50%, NFL, 48%, NHL, 50%, and MLB, 50%. Even combat sports rival boxing typically sees fighters receive 50% or more of event revenue for major fights. The UFC's model extracts maximum value from fighters while providing minimum compensation and protection. Demetrius Johnson, one of the greatest fighters in UFC history, worked in construction during his early UFC career to finance his fighting dream. When I fought Dominic Cruz for the bantamweight title in 2011, I was on a contract. I think I was fighting for $14,000 to show and $14,000 to win, Johnson revealed. He was fighting for the UFC Bantamweight Championship for $28,000. Even after becoming one of the most dominant champions in UFC history, Johnson noted he wasn't paid PPV points for most of his fights, significantly decreasing his earnings compared to less accomplished fighters who negotiated better deals. Charles Johnson's story from UFC Shanghai in 2024 crystallized the absurdity. Johnson scored a second-round knockout and earned a $50,000 performance of the night bonus, a career highlight that should have been celebrated. Instead, as MMA journalist Ariel Helwani reported, Johnson had been forced to borrow money from his manager, Brian Butler, just to keep his household afloat while preparing for the fight. A UFC fighter, competing in the world's premier MMA organization, had to borrow money to pay his bills between fights. This is the reality for the majority of UFC competitors. The financial structure guarantees that most fighters will struggle. They fight once or twice per year if they're lucky. They must constantly fund gyms, trainers, dietitians, nutritionists, physical therapists, and medical care. All of these costs continue whether they're fighting or not. Injuries can sideline fighters for months or years, creating financial drought with no income and mounting debt. When medical issues arise, fighters often lack adequate insurance. The UFC provides insurance only for injuries sustained during fights and official training camps. Anything outside those windows falls on the fighter. The pressure to fight injured, to accept fights on short notice for less money, to continue competing long past their prime, all stems from financial desperation. Fighters like Ortiz, taking boxing matches against Anderson Silva at age 46, aren't pursuing passion or legacy. They're trying to pay bills. Coleman selling his Pride Grand Prix trophy and UFC championship belts isn't about decluttering, it's about survival. The tragedy is that these weren't journeyman fighters who had mediocre careers. These were champions, Hall of Famers, the men and women who built the UFC into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Tito Ortiz's statement, "I lost everything after 2020, captures the fundamental brokenness of the system. A man who literally saved the UFC from bankruptcy, whose drawing power generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue over his career, ended up broke and operating a restaurant in Florida. The American dream he references in interviews isn't about achieving wealth through combat sports success. It's about rebuilding after combat sports destroyed whatever wealth he managed to accumulate. The pattern is clear, predictable, and entirely preventable. Financial literacy programs, mandatory escrow accounts, ensuring fighters can't blow through earnings immediately, pension contributions, health insurance, long-term disability coverage. All of these solutions exist and function in other professional sports. The UFC chooses not to implement them because doing so would reduce profit margins. Keeping fighters as independent contractors maximizes organizational profit while minimizing responsibility for fighter welfare. Standing in that Florida parking lot, Tito Ortiz represented not just his own financial failure, but an entire system designed to extract maximum value from fighters while providing minimum support. His confession, that he lost everything, wasn't just about one man's poor financial decisions. It was about an industry that treats its performers as disposable assets, that builds billion-dollar valuations on the backs of fighters who walk away broke, injured, and often suffering from brain damage that will plague them for life. The UFC champions who went broke instantly didn't lose their money in a single catastrophic moment. They lost it through 1,000 small cuts. Training expenses, medical bills, taxes, misplaced trust, financial illiteracy, and an organization that prioritized profit over people. They lost it because nobody taught them that championship money doesn't last forever, that careers end abruptly, that the same organization that celebrates you as champion will forget you the moment you stop winning. They lost it because combat sports has always been this way, burning through fighters and leaving them broken. And the UFC simply perfected the business model of exploitation that boxing pioneered decades ago.